Hello and welcome. This is Motivations and Barriers to Publishing Open Access Book Chapters and Monographs. I'm Allison Kafring.
My name is Joseph Thomas.
And I'm Jeannie Hoover.
The Code of Conduct is still in effect for this presentation. If you have any questions, you can reach out to the Charleston Conference hosts. So here's our brief roadmap for the presentation today. We're going to start with setting the stage of who we are and where we started with our research. Then we'll go into how we conducted our research, the results, and some discussion of how we saw overarching themes. And some next steps we decided to do after this, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So we're from East Carolina University. We're a public regional R2 in the University of North Carolina system. We're located in Greenville, North Carolina, which is east of Raleigh. We have a medical, dental, and engineering schools with about 25,000 students and about 2,000 faculty. So we decided to do this research because we noticed that open access monographs are becoming more popular and we got more questions from faculty about them. We noticed that the methods that were used for open access journals were not really translatable to monographs and they weren't necessarily as sustainable. Some models that we saw for monographs included library investment, like similar to direct to open, where libraries from across the nation or around the world sometimes will pay certain publishers a set amount of money every year, and the publisher will use that money to make X number of books open access. There's also publisher agreements, very similar to the publisher agreements we have with journals, where one institution will pay one publisher to have some of their fees waived or at university. And there's also the BPC, or the book processing charges. Moore et al. Talks about how there's a lot of variation in those charges, that they can really range a lot depending on how long the book is, but 15,000 seems to be the rough estimate of what people seem to really come back to. So to do our research, we decided that we wanted to look at what authors' perceptions were about open access for books, who authors thought should be paying those open access costs, and if the authors were aware of any tenure policies surrounding open access. We did this research in 3 parts. We started with a survey through Qualtrics. We had 39 participants. We then did interviews via Microsoft Teams. We had 13 participants. And then we did focus groups also on Teams. We had 3 different groups with about 3 to 4 people in each group.
In terms of the authorship data that we discovered, we discovered our pool of authors and the total publications that were available by running some reports in the faculty activity reporting system that we use here on campus. And we did a 3-year time span from 2021 to 2024. We found that there were 315 authors at our university. They published 107 books, unique books, and there were 356 unique chapters by these authors. And what we mean is for unique book counts, sometimes that there may be more than one author for the same book, so you would have double entries. We eliminated the duplicate entries to get these counts. What we found when we took a little bit closer look was that there were 30 publications that were already open access of some kind, and we started looking closer at the authors themselves to make sure they were still at the university. We eliminated some who had left ECU or who had publications that we could not verify. We did verify all of our publications using some other source, whether it was Scopus or Web of Science or some other database. When we took a look at the publication data themselves for the books, we found of those 107 books, they were published by 51 different publishers. The top publishers were Routledge with 13 books, Springer with 8, Cognella, Palgrave, and Rowman had 6 titles each. 3 titles were self-published, and there were 2 open access books. One was published by Archeo Press, and the other by MDPI Books. For the chapter level, those 356 chapters were contained within 275 books, so some books did contain more than one chapter. Those 275 books were published by 98 different publishers. Top publishers included Springer Nature. Springer had 57 chapters distributed across 42 books. 1 of those chapters was already open access. Routledge had 33 chapters in 30 books. There were 3 open access chapters already. Elsevier had 23 chapters in 20 books. Cognella had 22 chapters across 5 books. IGI Global had 17 chapters in 15 books. 2 of those chapters were already open access. In all, we had 30 open access chapters by 20 different publishers.
We're going to take a look at the surveys and focus groups and interviews that we conducted as part of this study. So we had a 17-question survey that we used in spring 2024. We had interviews that included 12 questions also in spring. And then this past fall, we added focus groups, which included 12 questions as well. So these questions, we really focused on their most recent book chapter or monograph publication. And then we also asked them their perception of open access publishing, specifically related to books and book chapters, although some of our discussions did lead into journal open access publishing. So in our survey responses, we received responses from 7 colleges, which included 22 different departments. Overwhelmingly, we had social sciences and humanities as the primary disciplines represented. We had English as the top discipline represented in our survey responses. Overall, most of the faculty that responded were tenured. And then we had an almost equal division between faculty who recently had books that were published or that they had recently published a book chapter. Most of the books that were published were not meant to be textbooks, although we have found that, they can be used as textbooks. And we found that only 8% had some kind of funding for their publications. Most were not aware of the option to publish open access when they were publishing their book chapter or monograph. So we had a few different impressions that we were able to get out of the survey. Some of our biggest takeaways were that there were concerns about the cost of open access publishing, and certainly how much those costs would be and who would be paying for those costs. There were also some concerns about reduced royalties. We did not necessarily have an in-depth discussion on royalties, but some faculty did note that that was a concern to them. There was a big interest in making their research available, especially to other researchers around the world, and they were also interested in making it free to read. We asked a question on if you could publish open access if costs were covered. And you can see from our chart that 59% said yes, 26% said depends on, and only 15% responded with no. Some of the comments to that question included that it would depend on who the publisher was, the prestige of that publisher, what the relationship between royalties would be, and if faculty would adopt the text for classes. We also asked faculty where funding for open access publications should come from. And so the top 3 results that we had were from grant funds, from their department or college, or from grant overhead. They also mentioned the library and membership programs, and we found that individuals paying for open access was the least popular option. We also asked faculty if open access status was considered in their tenure and promotion process. 58% said no, 36% said they weren't sure, and 6% said yes. Some of those comments that came from that question reflected, again, considerations on publisher reputation, if it was peer-reviewed, the quality of the work, royalties, and individual department unit code requirements.
Our interview results turned out being very similar to the survey results. We did have more opportunity for nuance and more discussions around some more explanations behind why some researchers chose these options. For our interviews, we had 5 biomedical researchers, 4 from humanities, and 4 from social science. The majority actually were not tenured in this interview process. 6 had open access publications, and 7 did not. 2 were intended to be textbooks, 6 were not intended, and 5 said that they were not intentionally created to be textbooks, but they could see it being used in a classroom, or they had heard that it had been. One of the most unique and interesting sort of results that we got from these interviews was to the question we asked about open access having all these costs and who should pay those costs. 5 researchers right off the bat just said not the author. 3 said the publisher should be paying. 2 said it from grants. 1 from the institution, 1 from the government, and 1 uniquely said that they thought Coca-Cola or other corporations should be contributing to these costs as well. Might notice these numbers a bit off. It's because we had 1 researcher say multiple different possibilities. We also had 1 researcher comment that I think it's inappropriate for the author to not only be writing for free, but then paying to have it published. It seems like a double whammy of sadness. Another thing we got a bit more into in our discussions in these interviews was about some of the benefits of open access and that it can be a larger reach. So a lot of our humanities and social science researchers who have more of a global scholarship, who either do research with or in collaboration with people internationally, or either just local communities that are not academics, they saw a more important emphasis in open access because the people that they're working with can have access to the actual work they're creating. So we had 1 researcher comment that it's so global reach. Who can afford your book? If it's everyone, that means you're going to get cited more often. More people are going to be able to engage in your work, including the raw data you might be presenting for the first time. So you're moving science forward.
So we had done this survey and the individual interviews in the spring, and we were somewhat concerned because out of the 277 authors, we felt like we didn't get a high enough response rate across both methods. So we went back to the pool of survey participants and invited 45 of those faculty members to participate in focus groups this fall. 12 of them accepted, and we grouped those faculty members into 3 different sessions. We held them via Teams and we recorded them. The authors came from 12 departments in 7 different colleges. You can see that there's a relative split across the various types of disciplines. We had 5 biomedical researchers, 2 from the humanities, 4 from social sciences, and 1 from the sciences. When we asked them about the most recent project that they were going to be describing in this focus group, there was 1 that was a traditional commercial textbook. 1 person spoke as an editor of a collection. There were 3 monographs, and 8 of the participants discussed chapters. 2 of the chapter authors were working on their first monograph now. When we asked whether this project was intended to be used as a textbook, 7 of our folks said yes, 2 said no, and 3 didn't answer the question. I mentioned before that 1 of them was a traditional commercial textbook, and that author was interested in royalties, although they didn't talk about the amount of the royalties. Most of the other pubs, when we ask about other publications that are open access, a lot of them did have prior publications that were open access. Generally, those were articles. In line with the questions that we asked in the individual interviews, one of them was who should pay the open access cost. By and large, across all 3 focus group sessions, they said not the authors. Some of them talked about using professional development funds. They talked about having the library or some other member of the institution provide funding, or using grant funds. One of them mentioned readers, but it was unclear whether they were talking about some sort of distributed paywall that was a low cost, or it wasn't really clear in the focus group. And then one of them talked about moving publishing back to the institutions to try to bypass some of the commercial publishers. One of the specific quotes that really caught our attention was, "It seems a little backwards that I have to pay to publish for my job requirements." So that was indicative of the sentiment that a lot of our authors had. When we ask whether open access to books or chapters factors into promotion and tenure, generally the authors said no, it's the quality review that's the most important factor. There were a couple of comments about predatory publishers and a concern about identifying predatory publishers. A couple of our faculty members talked about choosing open access venues and choosing open access in order to reach a specific audience. And their advice was to explain why you made those choices in your tenure packet so that the evaluators could understand that better. When we ask about the benefits and concerns related to open access publishing, similar to what we saw from the survey and the individual interviews, the accessibility of the content, a wider audience, including reaching members of the public, higher number of citations, and then no cost barriers for low and middle income countries were benefits that were mentioned in the focus groups. When we ask about concerns, primarily the faculty members talked about the credibility or reputation of the publisher, the transparency of peer review, and whether online format is the best for deep reading. It was interesting to us that during the focus groups, people didn't express the same concerns about cost as they did during the survey and the interviews. And an overall theme that seemed to come through was that authors don't think they should be writing and peer reviewing for free and then paying to publish. So that's in keeping with what we saw, that the authors should not be the ones to pay for open access.
So the general themes we saw across all three of our research projects, there was general confusion about the characteristics of open access. So not every author we talked to who had a publication that was open access was aware that it was open access. We also saw some confusion when we asked certain questions about what we meant or about different aspects of open access and how it related to who could access the material. This came across a lot more in our interviews and our focus groups, but there was still some confusion in the comments of the survey itself. There's also a general interest in the benefits of open access being available to everyone and increasing that engagement and citations. And we also saw cost as the biggest barrier in the interview and surveys, with peer reviewing for free than paying to publish as being a really big stickler point for a lot of our authors, as well as in difficulty in finding funding for open access monographs because they are so large and so expensive, as well as finding some grant funding for chapters for humanities and social scientists who aren't having access to as many grants as our science researchers.
We've identified a few next steps to support faculty in publishing open access chapters and monographs. We're going to continue to look for opportunities to expand support for open monographs and book chapters. One example of that is expanding our publisher agreements, which we recently did with IGI Global, that includes options for open access book chapter publishing. We're also added a note within our open access publishing support fund that faculty can apply for funding for book chapters and monographs, although there is a limited amount of funding up to $1,000. So for some monographs, that will not make that much of a dent to it. But we're going to continue to look for other options. Additionally, we're looking to support other open monograph publishing options, direct to open options as well, and we'll continue to do so. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to move into our Q&A section of this presentation. We also wanted to provide you our contact information, so if you have any questions about our study or anything that you would like to ask or comments, we would greatly appreciate it. We have a few questions for you that we would like to open up for discussion, either through chat or through unmuting yourself. So those questions include, have you had an increase in demand for OA for books and chapters? How does your library support open access for books and chapters? What concerns do your authors express about open access book or chapter publishing? What advantages are most frequently mentioned? And is open access considered during your P&T process on your campus? And with that, we will pause it and open it up for discussion.